everyone. Good morning. Welcome to another episode of What's Going On in Japan Tech Market Podcast. Today, I'm very excited to be accompanied with Terrie Lloyd, who is a very special entrepreneur in Japan, having founded, I guess, over 17 companies with the very successful, I think, companies like Daijob and whatnot. So, Terrie, I'm really excited today to talk with you and, welcome to the podcast today.
Yeah, thank you. It's my pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So Terrie, if you can let us know about yourself a little bit, what's going on recently?
Yeah, sure. Okay. So, well, I think probably people who know me know that um, I'm patient when I need to be patient, and I speed up when when things look like they're going to start going well. The last 2.5 years have been pretty tough. I run a travel company.
Yeah.
And of course, half of my business hasn't been allowed to do business because the government has been preventing people from traveling. Not just the Japanese government, of course. But anyway, so that has been a challenge, but at the same time, it's been an opportunity. And during the same period, we actually launched a new software company using some of the software that we've developed internally in the travel agency. So I guess I could say that basically my philosophy is, make lemon juice when you only have lemons, something like that. I can't remember how the phrase goes, but basically that lemon juice turned out to be a kind of ERP system for travel agents, which we set up down in Singapore. And I learned a lot about setting up a company in Singapore, which is actually pretty interesting. So yeah, I'm an innovator. I'm kind of resilient. Been in Japan 39 years, and during that period, I've had 3 ups and 3 downs.
See.
So I'm coming out of one of the downs at the moment. I don't consider COVID as a down. That's a flat, basically. For me, a down is when something actually very specifically targets your company. And you struggle to recover from it. So yeah, I have my scars, but because of that, of course, as you say, I founded 17 companies in Japan. I've been able to kind of understand the timing, and then know when a company should be segued, shut down, or sold. Hopefully, selling, of course, for a profit, and somehow been able to make it work. Yeah.
Awesome. I just, found a bit ago that you were also into the a job board recruitment kind of business as well. So can you tell us a little bit more, what was your first company you founded and how you currently running the tourism business?
Sure. Okay. So I got 3 questions there. Well, the first one, the HR question. In 1994, I got a phone call from a guy in the States. And he told me he was doing this new thing on this new media called the internet. And, some of us were using the internet back in 94. We were using it for email. And there was this text-based browser called Lynx. And then Netscape 1 came along and, things went from there. So anyway, he called me and said, hey, I need somebody in Japan because I'm doing this online recruiting. And, I was running an engineering company, a software engineering company, network development and other things. And I remember saying to him, well, nobody uses the internet. There's only a few of us on it. I could probably count the number of people who are using it. And he said, yeah, but the people who are using it are engineers. And don't you have problems trying to find engineers? And of course I did, just like everyone. So I thought, okay, maybe there's something in this online recruiting. So we got together. He came over to Japan. We set up a joint venture, but unfortunately, I couldn't get him to follow through and let me buy some of the shares. And I don't really want to be involved in somebody's company if I'm not actually part shareholder. I didn't need to have them all, but So as a result, we kind of separated ways in 95. And then I kept thinking about it. And in 96, I decided to go ahead and build Daijob.com. So it took me about 18 months. I'd done software development before then, but nothing serious. But I got lucky. I had a very, very good Australian developer who came to work for us. And we developed Daijob as a base. And as we're getting ready to launch, a lot of people said to me, well, recruiting has a really negative image. It's like, shady, and people use shady practices and stuff like that. And so I realized that if I was going to make this thing successful, I had to give it a unique name. And first of all, I was thinking about job, and then jobu. And then suddenly I thought, oh, what about Daijobu? It's okay, right? It's okay to switch jobs. And I found out that that domain name was actually owned by a guy who was a geologist working for an oil company, a Japanese fellow, who at that time was in Indonesia. And so I contacted him, and over the next 6 months, he would only send me emails once every 2 or 3 months because otherwise he was in the jungle. And anyway, so he sold me the domain name. And then I registered both Daijobu and also Daijob, big job. And so that's how the name came about. So it's kind of a play on words. It's kind of, you have to be a foreigner to make the mistake of saying Daijob is Daijobu. But somehow Japanese got it. And then that became a kind of like a signature phrase. And we became the first online mid-career recruiting company in Japan. In fact, that other company that was in the States didn't come until about 6 months later, and they didn't work out. And before that, the only other company that was even online was Recruit, and they were doing Sotogyo, like people graduating from university, which is their traditional space. So yeah, so we had the space all to ourselves, only no competitors. Can you imagine?
Wow.
And
Wish I was there.
yeah, within 18 months, we got 165,000 resumes. I don't know how many resumes they have now, but it must be more than that. And yeah, and things just went from there. So that was pretty interesting. Then, oh, by the way, I sold that company in 2005.
Yeah.
And then my first company in 1983 was a small translation agency I set up with my first wife. And doing translation, there's nothing particularly special about that. I actually didn't speak any Japanese at all back then, but obviously she did. But I knew about computers. And so we specialized in the computer industry. And for a while, I was the only person in Japan who spoke English, who knew what a laser printer or a hard disk or a CPU were, because I used to work in the computer industry in Australia before I came here. And so I actually started a side job. That company was called Link Japan. I still own it. And I started a side job, which was selling electronic parts, which I would buy in Akihabara and then sell to my old employer in Australia. Now, can you imagine what those parts were?
No idea. 1983. I wasn't born, so yeah.
Well, I used to go with a few $1,000s in my pocket down to those little alleyways, because back then there was still lots of little alleyways there. I would buy semiconductors which would be used in submarine detectors. And they couldn't get those transistors on the open market, but I could buy them in Akihabara just by popping down there on my bicycle and paying cash. So I would buy 50 or 100 of these things, put a 200-300% markup on it, and send them in the post down to Australia, when then they would suddenly become top secret and they would be built into submarine detectors called sonobuoys. So yeah, so the Sonobuoy submarine detection program in Australia has a Japan connection.
Oh, interesting. That's a very good, I mean, like a history, right? So you started as a translation company, and then you moved towards selling like exporting Japanese semiconductors to Australia. And then what happened? Like, what was next?
Well, and this is way back, in '85, there was an event called the Plaza Accord, And that's where the US and some European countries basically ganged up on Japan and said, hey, your yen is way too cheap. You're exporting way too much stuff to us too cheaply. We can't compete. Of course, China was to do the same thing 20 years later. Nobody complained. But anyway, Japan got the full brunt of that, and they had to revalue their currency. And I remember the currency went like in a space of 9 months from like 260 to the dollar to like 140 to the dollar. So suddenly all these exporters who were exporting out of Japan, they went out of business. So this is in 85, and then in 86, that really gained steam. And all of my customers in the translation industry, they all started setting up factories in places like Thailand and Malaysia and Taiwan. So suddenly they were breaking contracts with us and we had no business. So things were pretty dire. And in 86, I got a 2 million yen loan from a Japanese bank after promising I wouldn't run away when they gave me the money. And I took that 2 million yen and I went to Hong Kong and bought some laptop computers. And at that time, these were the first laptops that used the IBM PC operating system in the world. So I bought 10 of them back. I sold them for a 30% margin, sold 7. And then with the same proceeds, I went back to Hong Kong and bought another 10, and then 20, and then 100. And then that company moved to the first factory in China, in Shenzhen. So as far as I know, in 87, I was the first person to import PCs from China into Japan. So by that time, I was bringing in container loads. And of course, the Japanese stock market bubble was occurring, and there were lots of foreign companies coming into Japan, as well as lots of Japanese language schools teaching English to service those foreign companies. So I was selling hundreds of them, and that went pretty well. And then in 1989, I got a request from the Australian Trade Commission, who knew that I was in the computer business because I was the only one. There was me and IBM basically doing IBM clones and IBM operating systems. And they called me up and said, hey, we've got this thing called a local area network. And it has another thing called a server. And would you please come and install it? So I installed Novell's first local area network in Japan at the Austrade. And I blew up the server actually. But I quickly figured out what was supposed to happen, and I successfully installed it, reinstalled, and the first local area network was up and running.
In Japan, right?
In Japan.
In the Australian embassy.
And actually, it wasn't in the embassy. At that time, they were in a building called the Sankaido building, which is just down the road from the US embassy, actually. And yeah, so then I started getting all these requests from major companies, both Japanese and foreign, to install local area networks. And I hired a guy from India. Actually, he was in Hong Kong at the time, which is how I met him. And he turned out to be fantastic. So I asked him, are there any more guys like you in India who know about local area networks? Because no one here in Japan knows about them. He said, well, I don't know. Why don't you try? So I made a business with his father in Mumbai. And we ran a half-page ad in the what at that time was called the Bombay Times. And we had, well, he called me up and he said, I've got a big problem. I said, what's that? And he said, I have a 2-meter stack of resumes from engineers who want to come and work in Japan. And there's no, I mean, there's thousands. So there's no way that I'd be able to handle this. And I said to him, well, look for the letters LAM and only use those resumes. So out of a few thousand resumes, we managed to get 200. And then I picked out of the 200, he sent them by post. And then I picked the top 100. And I went there and I hired 2 people out of 100 people. And those guys were just like gods of computing, right? And now they're running bank IT infrastructure all over the world, and Goldman Sachs and various other companies. So from there, for the next 5 years, I would go to India 3 times a year. and I would interview 50 to 100 people, and I only hired 2 or 3 people each time. And in the end, I hired about 70 people, and that formed the basis for my networking uh, computer company, which at that time was called Link Computer. And that company was bought by EDS. So EDS, of course, being bought by HP, and all of HP's services business is the old EDS business, which in Asia was my business.
Wow.
So yeah.
Incredible. So that was between 1990 to 1995
That's
for,
right. And then, of
okay.
course, I used that money to make Daijob, and that was
Okay.
where Daijob came from.
And then since when? But I think you were always doing multiple businesses, right? It's not only one. So let's
Yes.
say from 1995, you started Daijob, or maybe 94. What else were you doing with Daijob as well?
Well, I've always loved content. It's been kind of like my fatal attraction. And I started in 1994. I started a magazine called Computing Japan. And I did a test. I sent out 1,000 magazines, and 500 people said they would subscribe. So I thought, oh, well, I'm going to have a big hit. What I didn't realize is that I sent out to the 500 people, the only 500 people who are interested in computers and Japan. So I could only ever get maybe 3,000 people as readers in Japan, which of course doesn't support a magazine. So then I started exporting the magazine to the US, and I got lots and lots of people. I sold like 10,000 every month in the US because computers and what Japan was doing, that was a big thing back then. But the problem is I lost a dollar on every magazine that I sold because the price of magazines back then. So in the end, I had to stop it because it was just costing me too much money. But I was still in love with content. So I started a new magazine called Japan Inc., which,
I think
yeah,
read about
so
it a bit.
right. So japaninc.com, that's INC, .com still exists, and all the back numbers are on there. And at some point, I'm going to resurrect the team and resume publishing. But at the moment, anyway, there's like 12 years of content on there. So, yeah, I've never really made money out of content up until we started Japan Travel.
Okay.
And then suddenly, it was focused enough, it was big enough. And now, we have great traction.
So I want to know more from Daijob, and then so you sold Daijob in 2005. So were you doing fully Daijob from 1995 to 2005, or Japan Travel emerged before?
Yeah, so no, Japan Travel started after the earthquake in 2011. At least the idea did. So, as far as Daijob is concerned, while I was running Daijob, of course, I started the magazine. So back then it was Computing Japan, and then transitioned into Japan Inc. So I was doing those two things. Yeah, those are pretty much all I did during that period. I mean, I dabbled in some other things, setting up a software company and doing a couple of other things. But, you do have to focus on your bread and butter. And especially in the IT sector, it's very competitive. So if you don't stay on top of your game, somebody else will take your customers away from you. And most of my customers were $1 million customers. So, there was always huge competition every year to keep that business. I mean, I had Dell, Microsoft, Morgan Stanley, most of the big banks, Goldman Sachs. And yeah, there was severe competition to keep the competitors out of those.
Was it the competition with the previous business that was you're doing before 95, like with the networking business? Like,
yes, that's right. So, oh, sorry. So, an important point: I started a second IT company.
okay.
Yeah. So, sorry, I left that point out. So that company was called Link Media, and so what happened is that after I sold Link Computer, I ran Daijob until 2005. But in 2000, I think, or 1999. I started a new IT company, and that IT company was called Link Media. And then I spun that off into a separate business later called BIOS.
Okay.
Sorry, if you've got 17 companies, it tends to get complicated. Don't worry.
Problem. Okay, so BIOS is there. So there's Japan, Daijob, and between that there's BIOS, which is the IT company to do what?
Well, originally it was just a continuation of what I was doing in Link Computer, which was selling networks and stuff like that. But we quickly realized that there was a new generation of server farms being developed. In the mid 2000s, we switched from maintaining computers to maintaining server farms. And so we had teams running bank server farms in various data centers around town. Back then, those data centers were just getting built.
Okay, so before that was network LAN thing, which was the like networking inside the office,
Yeah.
and then afterwards you were managing the data centers of the banks of the bigger companies. And okay, so
Yeah.
that company BIOS is it still here or?
BIOS is still alive and well. I personally sold the company during one of my down periods, unfortunately, to pay bills. So I think I sold it in 2010, as I recall. But I still ran it on the behalf of the shareholders until 2014. I think we sold it 2014, 2013 or 2014. I don't recall exactly.
Okay,
Yeah.
great.
So that company is still running, and actually we sold it to a Japanese company, which is related to uh, uh, Benesse, I think, as I recall, TMJ, a company called TMJ, and yeah, so they're still alive and well and doing okay, I understand.
So I think most of your companies are still doing well, right? Daijob or BIOS or even the one which was sold to ADS, later bought by HP. So those things are still there. Am I correct?
They are.
Okay.
That's right. Yeah.
Do you often catch up with some of the shareholders or some of the current members?
Well, it's a funny thing, when somebody buys your company, they don't really want you to be involved after that.
I see.
I mean, maybe that's not funny. They want you to stick around as long as until everything's clear.
Hmm.
So you're like an insurance policy. I've been fired 3 times by the acquirers, and partly it's because I'm not a good employee. I do what I think I should do, not what I'm told to do. So I'm kind of unemployable. And then partly because, like I say, I was an insurance policy. And by the second time, I realized, oh, this is normal. I shouldn't get upset about it. And yeah, it's kind of good because then you're not responsible after that. You don't have to think about it.
See.
But do I stay in touch with those companies? Actually, surprisingly, with Daijob, even though most of the staff who are there now don't know me, they know of me. And so I often find new people starting at Daijob asking for connections on LinkedIn, for example.
Wow.
So yeah, it's not like it's making, it's not particularly much use for me, but if it makes them feel better to be
Mhm.
connected to the founder, and occasionally somebody will ask me a question or something, I mean, I'm happy to do it. That's fine.
Great to see your brainchild's like flourishing all over the world. So I'm
Yeah.
very excited, to know about Japan travel because, as I said, my friend used to work there, and I think it's a pretty cool platform, right? With Docomo, you guys have connected. So I don't know much. I want to know from you, like, what's Japan travel is.
Well, first of all, it's not just a travel agency. And often people hear the name and think, oh, you guys are a travel agency. That is part of our business. But actually, Japan Travel is 3 different businesses. It's a marketing and publishing company, it's a travel agency, and it's a software business. So, of course, your friend was a software engineer. So you've heard about the software projects that we worked on. But what I was trying to do is integrate all 3. I'm not sure that I've been entirely successful in integrating all 3, but at the same time, all 3 businesses have become somewhat successful. Although, of course, with COVID, it'll be another couple of years before the travel agency can really come into its own. So on the content, publishing, marketing side of things, we back after the earthquake in 2011. I had a very powerful dream, and my grandfather, who had been dead for many years, came to me in my dream and gave me some very good advice. And the core of the advice was to share everything. So I did have a small software company at the time, and I asked those software guys to stop what they were doing and then start working on a content sharing system, like user-generated content. And I actually filed for a couple of patents about how to maintain quality control for large crowds producing UGC. And so we developed the core system. And with that, we launched a program of recruiting people around Japan, especially after the earthquake and the radiation scare. There were a lot of people who didn't want to come to Japan, right?
Yeah.
But of course, unless you're in Fukushima, actually, most of Japan was perfectly safe. And so I wanted people to help me tell the story that Japan's a great place and you should come here and just, don't go to Fukushima, fine, but the rest of it is perfectly okay. And so as a result, I recruited maybe about 400 people directly over the phone and by email. And then we launched the system and we had a bunch of content on there and that sort of grew. And then we had 2,000 people. And by 2013, we're like 2,500 people generating content. And now we're at about 21,000. So we became the world's largest producer of inbound travel content to Japan. I mean, the government's the largest. They have a $150 million budget. But in terms of just share coverage and diversity and that sort of thing, and certainly as a private organization, we're number one by far. So, of course, we had to build the software to make that work. And that business is kind of segued. Originally, I thought it would be like an online advertising business. But actually what happened is it turned out to be a services business. And so all of those people who were our community members, we started asking them to do service type work, like creating content for customers and going and doing test tours and critiquing the tours so they could be improved and that kind of thing. So that side of the business actually is still doing very well, even during COVID. We're dealing with about half of the prefectures in Japan. And in some of the prefectures, we're the main content partner. So, of course, now we do social media, we do virtual tours, we're getting into digital souvenirs, all kinds of things. And then the travel agency started in 2016. And basically, I did that because I got some high net worth individuals who kept asking me, can't you organize tours for us? And I felt kind of dumb because we called ourselves Japan Travel, but actually we're a media business and we couldn't help those people with their actual travel. So anyway, started the travel agency and then started doing software development to make it more efficient because the travel sector is in sad shape. The OTAs, Booking.com and Expedia, they've really taken over the market. But there is still about 30% of the global travel market which has to be serviced by humans.
Certainly.
And the reason is because, they're groups or they have special needs or they're doing something special that doesn't fit the one size fits all that the OTAs offer. So, the global travel market in 2019 was about $1.5 trillion. So it's still a $500 billion market. It's still pretty big. And for Japan, it pretty much holds. The Japan inbound market in 2019 was about 40 billion. And the travel agency part of that was about 12 or 13 billion. So big enough for us. But we had to get all our systems sorted out. And that's why I brought Hamid, your friend, in originally to help me out. But we quickly realized that there was another opportunity, and that led to the third business. And that was that there were these big Japanese companies that were supplying services to travelers, and they really sucked at it. Their UX is terrible, their user experience is terrible. And so we started approaching some of those companies. And one of those companies runs 12,000 electric bikes. You mentioned the name before. And basically, we did a deal with them to rewrite their UX and then basically connect with their system so that our users could rent bikes. And in 2018, that was actually going pretty well. Sometimes we had 60 to 100 bike rentals per day. But 2019, that company, as Japanese companies tend to do, decided that they would improve their own interface and start competing with us. I guess they didn't want us to be too successful. And so our numbers dropped. And then, of course, COVID hit the following year. So that's a company that has been quite difficult to deal with, but I'm still connected with them. We still rent their bikes. And then the second one, which is probably more interesting, and Hamid did work on this as well. We did an integration with Sagawa Cubing. And as far as I know, we're the only company in Japan that has been able to do this. We actually created a new front end for Sagawa Cubing. And that front end is in English, Chinese, and a couple of other languages. There's no paper, and it's all prepaid by credit card, which Sagawa Cubing doesn't do any of those things. And then we take those orders and we push them through API into Sagawa Cubing's system. And then their drivers show up, they pick up the bag, and they deliver it per the instructions on the computer. So that service is called Zend. And we got ready to launch Zend in March of 2020. Now, COVID hit in March of 2020. So Zend has not seen daylight yet. And no doubt we now have to go back and review the system because it's been almost 3 years. But I plan to launch that again sometime next year.
So that service is with Sagawa Cubing, which is like a delivery service in Japan. And what you did, like kind of change their UI to English or other languages for customers?
We did three key things, right? We changed the language. Although they do have an English language system, it's not easy to use. The second thing, which is more meaningful, is that we did away with paper. So in the past, if you wanted to use Sagawa Cubing, you had to create a delivery form that they could, then ingest into their system. So we did away with that. And the third thing that was really important is we took credit cards. And how we did that was very simple. We just promised Sagawa Cubing that we would pay the bill at the end of the month, whatever it was. And they were okay with that.
Awesome. So I'm quite clear about your journey. It's very exciting, lots of ups and downs, but as you mentioned, like being resilient is the key. I also personally think in my short career, like of 3-4 years, that resilience is a skill which you really need to develop at an early stage. And people who become successful, I think this is a very important ingredient in their success.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that immigrants in the US are responsible for most of the startups in places like Silicon Valley, right? And, Japan needs to understand that as well. I think actually it is starting to understand that immigrants are resilient by necessity. They don't have the support networks. And I'm an immigrant, you're an immigrant. And because we don't have those support networks, we either make or break. And we don't have time to have emotional confusion. It's pretty simple. You either eat or you don't. So as a result, where Japan has a problem with young people being too comfortable and wanting to rely on well-trod tracks, immigrants are forced to, they are different. They don't have those support networks. They have to try different things. So I've never been scared to try different stuff. And because I know half of it's going to fail, I also know not to be surprised. And that is, of course, part of resilience is mental resilience, right? Never be too enthusiastic, never be too surprised, never be too excited, because you don't know what's going to come up to, attack you at the end.
Yeah. So this is the last part of this podcast. I've started doing this. It's called the lightning round. I will ask you a question. You need to answer in one word. Are you ready for that, Terrie?
Sure.
Okay. So the first question is what brought you to Japan?
Kimchi.
Kimchi.
Yes.
The Korean food.
Yes.
Okay. All right. And
you said I could only say one word. So.
Yeah. Maybe you can extend a little bit to this question. Like, what one advice would you give to someone who's building their career in Japan in maybe tech?
In one word.
Maybe in one line for this one.
Don't give up. Believe in yourself.
Is it applicable for any industry, right? Not only tech.
Any
Yes.
industry.
Any industry. Awesome. Texting or talking?
Both.
Favorite TV show?
None.
One place you want to visit ASAP? Like, it could be any country, city.
None.
One book or podcast you want to recommend to our viewers?
What's going on in Japan tech?
Oh, wow. That's my pleasure. Thank you so much. Anything else?
No, not really.
Okay.
Okay, there is one. There is a book called Naked Leader by David Taylor. It's out of print now, but you can get it on Amazon. It's a cookbook for leadership for managers and managers of people. Means leadership of people. It's a fantastic book.
I'll definitely check it out. I love reading and also listening to podcasts, so definitely will do that. This is the final question of this podcast. If someone has $50,000 in their pocket right now, what would be your advice to do with that money?
What type of person are they?
I mean, maybe same person as me, like young, motivated, maybe an immigrant.
Well, of course, it depends on that person's aspirations, right? So if the person aspires to be an entrepreneur, then I would suggest they take $10,000 and invest it in a startup and watch the startup closely to learn all the mistakes that should be made as a startup. It would be a great way of learning on the job, so to speak, without necessarily jeopardizing your existing job. So I would suggest that. On the other hand, if you're an immigrant and you are stuck and you have nothing to eat, I would suggest taking maybe $20,000 of that money and hiring one person to help you build a business. I said in 1986, I went with $20,000 down to Hong Kong and bought PCs.
Yeah.
So I didn't spend everything that I had. I had a little left over. I would suggest the same thing. Keep some left over, but make a meaningful investment in your future.
Okay, so first one you mentioned like invest $10,000 to a business. So is it like while day-to-day job you just invest to up some other business? Because I don't think you can invest in a startup like $10,000. People write down so much big checks right nowadays.
No, I regularly start companies where the very first round people come in for $10,000 or $20,000.
Is it in Japan or overseas?
Oh, both actually. But I'm a strong believer in having a core group of friends and family, so that when you start getting more professional investors later, you've got a little bit of momentum and mass to your investor base. And also smaller investors tend to be more forgiving if you make a few mistakes, whereas those big guys, they've just come down on you like a bunch of sharks. So I think friends and family is actually a pretty important round. So there are enough companies being started here in Japan that you will be able to find somebody who's just getting started and they have a good idea and you like them and you think they're good. You take $10,000 out of that 50, put it in there and tell the person you invested that you want to talk to them once a month and find out what's going on. So it's kind of like education.
Awesome. And the second one is more like you hire someone to do something.
That's right. So one of the biggest mental challenges for a founder, especially somebody capable, is learning that the next person who comes along is not going to be as capable. And so you have to spend quite a lot of time training them. But if you get it right, if you get the right person, and 50% of the time I get it wrong, but in the 50% of the time that you get it right, that person eventually will be able to replace you and expand you. So like, obviously if you can get them to do the job you did as a single entrepreneur, you get to hire another person and then another and another. And if the person you first hired is good enough, then you make them a manager, right? So then you start to understand the power of magnification or amplification of your own efforts by getting other people to have to learn through you, close to you, have a similar value system. And in that way, I have a rule of thumb actually that for every power of 10, I have another layer of management. So at 10 people, one manager, at 100 people, 10 managers, at 1,000 people, 100 managers. So that's a generalization, it could be plus and minus, but basically that's worked very well for me. And so when I have 10 managers, those 10 people, I will have spent a lot of time personally with them. And I know how they think and they know how I think. And so they can replicate the company culture across the next layer. So it takes about 2 or 3 years. But anyway, that first $20,000, maybe 6 months worth of salary before the person's productive, a million, right? And that's where the money comes from.
Okay, so yeah, thank you so much, Terrie, for your time today. I think it's almost the time, and I really appreciate all the learnings. I hope our viewers will also enjoy. And yeah, thank you again for your time.
Great. Thanks very much, Siddiqui. I really appreciate it. It's been great being with you.